Hello. What we're going to talk about today is Britain before feudalism. That will cover prehistoric Britain, Roman conquest, and Anglo-Saxon settlement on the British Isles, as well as the Norman conquest of Great Britain. What you can see on this first slide is a seminal work of ancient British art, the first three-dimensional figurine to have been found on British territory. It marks the beginning of how the British saw themselves and felt about themselves and made themselves an independent, autonomous unity. It was also found on the territory of England that is considered to be the cradle of Britannia, Norfolk, in a northeastern part of modern-day England. What does it make you feel? I think it is a rather expressive statuette, full of emotion, full of life. Before we dive into the prehistoric times, let us take a look at one of the most famous cultural sports of the time. What do you know about it? I'm pretty sure you've recognized one of the most famous sports in England to this day, which is Stonehenge. Stonehenge remains one of the most mysterious constructions of the ancient world, not just of Britain. Its presumably first wooden version appeared around 2800 before Christ. But the spot on which it appeared had already been ritualistically significant for about 500 years. Around 2200, the first stone circle was created, known as Stonehenge. That marked one of the biggest cultural transitions in human history, from wood to stone, in creating significant monumental structures. Apparently, it took a very long time to build. It was initially made of bluestone, a volcanic material. That type of material was said to have magical and healing characteristics. The modern construction, Stonehenge number 3, is a complex of trilithons made of sarsen or sandstone. Since 2200s, the construction had been changed and rebuilt several times. The circles we can see in the picture are the result of 1600 before Christ reconstruction. The purpose of the construction is unclear. The purpose of the whole thing is unclear. It may have been a pilgrimage site or a place for healing rites or an observatory or a giant sundial or a place for ritualistic gatherings. Or maybe Stonehenge functioned as of the above, but in different times of its existence. Before the Romans came to the British Isles, people had been living there for several hundred years. Those early inhabitants were some hunter-gatherer tribes about whom we don't really know much. Those peoples were neighbors to mammoths, for example. They came to Norfolk, which I have said had been a cradle of the British people, about 900,000 years ago. First nomadic tribes appeared in the Isles in the Stone Age, which is about 15,000 years ago. At the time, the British Isles didn't quite look like the British Isles we're used to. A lot of territories where the ancient people lived are now actually underwater. The city of Salisbury remains one of the most religiously significant spots in Britain to this day. It's home to Salisbury Cathedral, a Gothic building that is the tallest medieval building in Britain. This is a masterpiece by an English painter of the 19th century, John Constable. This masterpiece you can see in the slide. Salisbury Plain, as you could see from the last slide, is also home to the construction we have already been discussing, Stonehenge. So this is prehistoric Britain. Fast forward to the rise of the Roman Empire, which by the last century before Christ was at its peak, marked with the biggest territory, political stability, and continuous military success. On the slide, you can see one of the most famous Roman sites on the territory of Britain. Do you know what it is? It looks a bit like the Great Wall of China, I think, but in fact it is actually much smaller and much shorter. This is the Hadrian's Wall, one of the seminal buildings that the Romans have left after themselves in Britain. This construction marked the border between the Roman realms and the realms of the northern tribes. We do know that the Romans came to try and take British Isles by storm. They did manage, but only to an extent. Some of the British tribes really did refuse to obey to the Romans. Those northern tribes were really hostile and strong and independent. So instead of obeying to the Roman rule, they were ready to try and conquer the Roman settlements themselves. In order to prevent that, the Romans built several walls that would serve as some sort of restraint for those northern tribes that were already hostile and independent, as I've said, to try and prevent those invasions from the north. Here is one more monument that wasn't really erected during the times of the Roman Empire. It was erected much later, but it commemorates one of the most significant times when the British tribes, the tribes of the British Isles, tried to, again, not obey and stay independent of the Roman rule. This is the statue of the Roman leader, a woman whose name was Boudica. She is pictured here with her daughters. During the times of the Roman rule over Britain, Boudica's husband, who was king of one of the kingdoms, and at the time of the Roman invasion, Britain was a set of different separate kingdoms that weren't quite good toward each other. So Boudica, as I've said, was the wife of one of the leaders of such kingdoms. When the Romans came, they slaughtered the kingdom and killed Boudica's husband. They also raped Boudica and her daughters. But that didn't break Boudica and her family, so she decided to rise for a revolt against the Roman rulers. She had been quite successful for a while, but she ended up, together with the people who supported her, she ended up downtrodden, and she never really succeeded in her revolt against the Romans, but she did manage to become one of the symbols of the British independence and fight for freedom. Back to the beginning of the Roman conquest. By 100 before Christ, Britain was a rather wealthy country with developed agriculture and good soils. The Romans were mainly interested in the British Isles primarily as a trading partner and a source of wealth. England at the time was, as I've said previously, a set of 15 small kingdoms. The invasion started out with some kind of a visit and continued with the English paying Rome money and taking in the Roman ways of life, with some of the tribe leaders pledging their loyalty to Rome. That happened in the year of 55 before Christ. in the year of 43 before Christ. However, this is the year that marks the start of the actual conquest, with the Emperor Claudius winning the Battle of Medway in the modern territory of the County of Kent. What the Romans did was they built and directed towns, roads, and a large part of infrastructure, as well as they introduced some of their law. They also marked the beginning of Christianity in the British Isles and provided significant impact on the language that was spoken on the British Isles. The Roman period is sometimes referred to as one of the most, if not the most, peaceful periods of British history. However, some of the British tribal leaders, dissatisfied with the state of sometimes literal slavery that they had to endure, attempted to overthrow Roman rule. I have already mentioned the rebellion of Boudicca that happened in 60 AD. As I've said, after the revolt, the Romans finally prevailed. Boudicca's army was destroyed, with Boudicca poisoning herself to the death. And as I've mentioned, she is now one of the most important independence symbols and part of British folklore. As I've already mentioned as well, Boudicca wasn't really the only one who was fierce and strong. The northern parts of the British Isles, called Caledonia, now known as Scotland, refused to live by the Roman rules. As I've said, the Romans feared invading it, so they built the Hadrian's Wall. Hadrian was the emperor at the time, to prevent the Scottish peoples from invading Roman Britain, as well as to prevent the Britons from moving to Scotland. 20 years after Hadrian's Wall, another one was built, the Antonine Wall, after the Roman Emperor Antonius Pius. Here are some of the results of the Roman conquest of Britain, especially the Latin influence in the English language. First of all, you can see the influence occurred in terms of some geographical names. For example, the Latin word castra, that literally meant camp, resulted in several endings of the British territories, such as Castor, Chester, and so on. For example, Lancaster, Manchester, Leicester, and so on. Also, the names of Albania, Britannia, and Caledonia were derived from Latin. Some religious terms, as I've said, the Latin influence also was reflected in the start of Christianity in the British Isles. So some of the religious terms were borrowed from Latin, such as baptism, bishop, and many more. As I've said earlier, a lot of the peoples of the British Isles at the time took on some of the Roman habits, as well as some of the common names, such as butter, cheese, copper, fork, mile, pound, street, and wall, which are now very common English words. So we know now that they have derived from Latin. However, Latin influence in English didn't stop with the Roman conquest. We do remember that during Renaissance and Enlightenment, the Latin influence was also strong in England. So some late borrowings include a lot of words connected with technology, science, and enlightenment. For example, curriculum, enthusiasm, ratio, syllabus, and so on. We can still see a lot of Latin influence in the English language. It is rather evident. Yeah, we can see that the Roman epoch had left quite a mark on not just the British history, but also its culture and language. The next epoch we're going to talk about today is the epoch of the Anglo-Saxons. Here is one of the cultural monuments of the Anglo-Saxon epoch in the British Isles. Can you guess what this is? This is clearly a monument of visual culture, and you've probably guessed that this is a map. This is the Anglo-Saxon Mappa Mundi, which means the map of the world. You can see that it's quite different from what we now know as maps. This map didn't really serve the purpose of orienting in space. It doesn't really mark the geographical territories, and these territories are not really geographically accurate in terms of what they looked like, where they were. This is more of a visual representation of different types of territories that may occur. For example, you can see some rivers, islands, forests, and so on this map. There are also some cities, some of the names, some of the castles and fortresses. So this is more of a studying material, I would say, rather than something that would help you orient in space, which I think is really fascinating. Like, who would have thought that a map could look something like that? As for the beginning of the settlement of Anglo-Saxons in Britain, we do remember from history of Europe that in the 5th century, Western Roman Empire virtually ceased to exist, and the Romans left the British Isles. But no rest for the wicked. After the Romans had left, there were new peoples from Europe that wanted Britain all to themselves. Not all Britain had been Romanized by the time of the collapse of the Roman Empire. During the 4th century, the Scots and the Picts attempted attacks on Roman Britain from the north and the south of the Isles. The Germanic peoples, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes came from Europe, which was part of the so-called migration period or barbarian invasions. The locals failed to defend themselves, for they lacked both skills and weapons to fight. Britain witnessed some of the most brutal carnages and massacres of all time. Some historians note, however, that the Romanized tribes of the British Isles invited the Europeans to protect their lands from the northern and western attacks. The Anglo-Saxon peoples had settled on the British Isles and called the place England by the 8th century. At this time, England was still a set of divided kingdoms. The 9th century witnessed major changes under the rule of Alfred the Great, King of Wessex, who not only carried out important political reforms, but also prevented the Vikings, the ferocious Scandinavian peoples, from conquering the British Isles completely. But the Danes, those Viking peoples that Alfred was so fiercely fighting with, still became a prominent part of the British population of the time. Hence the Scandinavian setting of the famous Anglo-Saxon literary work, Beowulf. However, before Beowulf, Anglo-Saxons had produced a number of significant manuscripts. First of all, there was a monk, writer, and Saint Gildas the Wise, or Gildas Sapiens, which was the Latin name of his. His most famous work, on the ruin and conquest of Britain, was written by the 7th century AD, fully in Latin. It is a three-part sermon element on how the Britons actually never wanted to break up with the Romans and let the barbarian peoples in purposefully. Another important persona in medieval Britain's culture was Bede the Venerable. He is considered the father of English historiography, having written the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, also in Latin, in about 731 AD. It was initially a history of Christian churches, but it also contained historical information on England itself. Alfred the Great later ordered that it was translated into the English language from Latin. Another work that Alfred supposedly ordered to be done was the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. That became the first English chronicle and was based on Bede's writing, as well as some oral tales. It contained the history of the British Isles from 495 to 1154. One of the most significant characteristics of the chronicle was that it was written in Old English, not in Latin. The work was seen by Alfred as an important step towards the unity of the states on the British Isles. And last but not least, one of the most famous examples of English folklore and literature as a whole is Beowulf, an old English epic poem created sometime between 700 and 1025. It wasn't written down until 925, maybe even later. What's interesting about this story is that the action in Beowulf takes place in Scandinavia, and the story wasn't very Christian, pagan, more like it. The poem is a traditional epic tale of a hero, Beowulf, who slayed monsters and dragons and became king, dying in the battle and buried according to pagan rituals and traditions. The poem is one of the most translated into modern English. The newest translation, produced only in 2020 by Maria Devana Headley, starting the first line not with the traditional what, but with bro. Alfred wanted to unite the divided kingdoms of the British Isles, in which his successors succeeded. His grandson, Aethelstan, is considered the first king of the United England, the England as we know it now. The rule was established as Saxon Christian rule, which improved the connections with Rome. Of course, British culture, as versatile as it was already then, started much earlier than the Anglo-Saxon period, but the epoch of the Anglo-Saxon conquest was the time of the rise of the British culture, and in a lot of ways, the formation of British identity. Here you can see some of the results of the Anglo-Saxon invasion on the British Isles, first of which being the prominence of the ruling aristocracy and the rule of the church. These two ruling classes will remain firm and stable and strong up until the modern times. It is now, during the 21st century, known that aristocracy is no longer the ruling class. The change happened during the 19th century when the working class, the middle class, rose to prominence. Also, church arguably doesn't really play that much role in the British politics anymore. It is not even a large part of the social life of the Britons. As I've said, some of the major cultural changes and milestones were achieved. British historiography started, British folklore received some of its major works. Of course, the Anglo-Saxons introduced some linguistic changes. As we know, during the Roman Britain, the British Isles mainly spoke Latin, other than any other languages. The Anglo-Saxon rule saw the development of the English language, as well as the prominence of other non-Roman languages of Britain, the heritage of the Celts, of the Picts, and the Scots. Also, during the time of the Anglo-Saxon invading Britain, unified England that was so desired and that so many rulers of the British Isles tried to achieve, fell to the Vikings by the 11th century. That happened due to the internal conflicts. Britain fell apart, fell into a set of divided kingdoms again. And there were also a lot of questions of succession. Who would be the next king of England? All that led to an alliance with the Normans. We're still continuing to talk about medieval England, and here is one of the biggest monuments of the Middle Ages in England. I'm sure you've seen it. This site is situated in the very heart of London, which is England's capital to this day. In the center of the picture, you can see the White Tower, which is one of the most prominent parts of a very famous fortress that started out London as the capital. The fortress is called the Tower of London. It is situated on the banks of the River Thames, not far away from the city, and not far away from the very famous Tower Bridge. This fortress served as home to the kings, as the court, as a prison, as the place of capital punishment, where a lot of people had been beheaded, including some of the monarchs of England. And it being the heart of London also brings it to a very interesting place. As I've said, it is a neighbor to the very contemporary, very state-of-the-art, innovative place, which is the city, which is full of just the buildings of concrete and stone and glass, which creates a really interesting effect, a contrast with the 11th century Tower of London that was built by William the Conqueror. Let us talk about England before the Norman Conquest, and then dive into what the Norman Conquest really resulted in. In the 10th century, the territory of the British Isles was as rich and fertile as ever. The Romans previously found it very attractive for that. The Danes, the Scandinavian tribes, did not cease with their attempts at laying their hands on the territory and on the peoples, their potential serfs and slaves. The country that kings like Alfred and Athelstan tried to unite was divided again, and weak too. The armies were using outdated tactics. They had to beg for peace and start paying a lot of taxes to the Danes. Canute, the Danish prince, conquered the British territory, now known as England, and became King of England in 1016, 50 years before the Normans came to the Isles. Canute's wife, Emma, was a Norman princess, and their marriage marked the continuation of the Norman intrusion into the British politics. Canute proclaimed himself King of England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. He was a strong, clever, cunning, and violent ruler. Britain, that had been drowning in the blood of the Danes before Canute and his father Sweyn, now continued drowning in the massacres of the British people conducted by the Vikings. Canute was also king of Denmark and Norway and an ally to Rome. It was under his rule that England was called England for the first time. Those who followed him, however, his sons Harold and Harthacnut, didn't live up to their father's glory. They lost their throne to another son of Emma's, Edward, who, together with his mother, lived his whole life in Normandy, the territory of modern France, which made him an actual English king only to a certain extent. He ascended to the throne at the ripe age of 37, after 26 years of Danish rule over Britain. 1042 is considered one of the official end of the Vikings trying to usurp the British throne. The new king, being a descendant of the Angles, Vikings, and Normans, spoke French and pledged his loyalty to Normandy, not Britain. In 1050, a Frenchman was appointed the Archbishop of Canterbury, the main churchman in England. In 1051, Godwin, a mighty Earl of Wessex, as well as Leofric, Earl of Mercia, whose names you might want to remember, were exiled from Britain for refusing to obey the new English king from Normandy. The Normans brought new military technology and tactics to the British Isles. The rule of Edward the Confessor was stable, relatively uneventful, and the king himself, although capable of overtaking the throne, seemed quite unremarkable. A childless man, he also didn't leave an heir. On this slide, you can see on the left the photograph of the Canterbury Cathedral, one of the monuments of the Norman times in Britain. It was erected and later rebuilt, and now is a rather significant building in the history and culture of Great Britain. On the right, you can see the picture of Lady Godiva, who was the wife of the previously mentioned Godwin, Earl of Wessex, who had to go to an exile, who is also quite symbolic and a very interesting figure in the history of Britain. As I've said, Godwin, Earl of Essex, who was the rebellion nobleman in 1051, was a very important figure in the history of England. He happened to produce the next heir to the English throne. He wasn't a legal heir, but he managed to undertake Wales, the north of the Isles, and the control of the south. He also claimed that Edward promised the throne to him. He was crowned on the 6th of January, 1066. The history of his coronation and his subsequent fall to the Norman army was depicted by the so-called Bayeux Tapestry. The Bayeux Tapestry is one of the most important documents and artworks of Anglo-Saxon Britain. It looks like a giant comic strip while being 70 meters long of embroidery. It depicted the Norman invasion and served as a means of propaganda commissioned by the French and explaining why the Norman conquest was inevitable and had to happen. It could be moved and displayed all around Britain like a giant spectacle and a medieval method of political battle. Like any comic strip, it wasn't supposed to portray things as they were, but rather as they felt and as they were supposed to be seen. However, William, the Duke of Normandy, disagreed with the appointment of the new king in England. He was Edward's cousin, previous Duke of Normandy's bastard, and also barely had any rise to the throne, so he gathered his armies and led them to the Isles. At the time, Britain was, as before, divided, and most of the earls leading to Harold's armies simply gave up the territories they were in charge of, marrying their daughters to Norman knights. William's army was numerous and extremely powerful. He managed to gather a lot of allies and a huge fleet. It only took him 6 weeks to get to London. Harold, in his turn, didn't receive the support he expected. In the infamous Battle of Hastings, on the 14th of October 1066, King Harold died, and England lost its Anglo-Saxon king. October the 14th marks the official start of the Norman invasion and William the Conqueror's ascent to the throne in England. Here is the Bayeux Tapestry version of what William I, William the Conqueror, looked like. They say he was a strong and healthy man, about 1.7 meters in height, although no portraits of him really have been found. He is said to have been one of the greatest military men of his time, skillful, resilient, and agile. He also had an army that was using top-notch military technique for the time. It seemed like Harold really stood no chance against him, so England gained a new Norman king. The king was greedy beyond compare, aiming at gathering as much territory and money as he could. Southern and central Britain wasn't enough for him, so he headed north very quickly and determinedly. Everywhere he went, he built a new castle, like the Tower of London in England, a perfect example of an architectural style called Romanesque, the one that was very popular in medieval Britain. Roman or Romanesque style came to Britain from France, together with the Gothic buildings of the Anglo-Saxon period. You can clearly see the difference between the two styles if you look at them. But back to William. Nothing stopped him from getting more land and money. As I've said, his next goal was the northern regions of Britain. As we know, the north wasn't the easiest place to conquer, always fighting and defending themselves to the last drop of blood. As a clever army man, William understood that the only way to invade them was to kill as many of them as he could and destroy their towns. The northern earls rebelled and fought back, but William left parched land where he went, no mercy to anything or anyone whatsoever. This terrifying time in the winter of 1069-1070 was labeled the harrying of the north. The Anglo-Saxon rulers lost the majority of their lands to the Normans. A lot of the Anglo-Saxon noblemen fled to the British Isles, never to come back. A lot of them, as I've said, fled. To establish his power even further, William ordered the first ever population survey to mark his belongings in the British Isles and tell the people living in those territories how much money they should pay him. The document that resulted from the Great Survey was written in Latin with the help of the translators from Old English and called the Domesday Book. Doomsday is the Old English spelling of, doomsday. It got its spooky name, as legend says, from the fact that the information in it was as true and unquestionable as the looming doomsday. The lands were destroyed during the harrying of the north and were marked in the Domesday Book as uninhabited and empty. Britain was ruled by the Normans only for about 88 years, but that period was one of the most formative ones in British history. Here are the rest of the kings of the Norman England. Here is Cardiff Castle, an example of Romanesque architecture. This is Cardiff Castle, somewhere around the end of the 19th century, a bit rebuilt, but still remaining as Romanesque as ever. Some of the Gothic style Romanesque rebuilt Anglo-Saxon and Norman architecture is here. And of course, we can't really avoid talking about the language impact that the Norman conquest left on England. As I've said, Normandy was part of what we now know as France. So the Normans were French-speaking peoples, which is why England got divided into the English-speaking serfs and the French-speaking masters after the start of the Norman invasion. The elites were French. The language of court, official matters, and church was mainly French, although the usage of Latin and English was still widely spread. French influenced all of those spheres in different ways. Even place names had to change their spelling and pronunciation due to Norman influence. Some of the following words, see the slide, were borrowed from early French. The language of the invaders became the language of business and punishment. Borrowings from French, like borrowings from Latin, weren't just restricted by the medieval times. Throughout the whole history of Britain, their French frenemies continued to affect the English. As has been said before, the English aristocracy at the time partly fled Britain, partly had to adapt to the new French-like reality. William I appointed Frenchmen almost everywhere. Only 3 churchmen out of 20 were English at the time of William the Conqueror. At the time of Norman conquest, only French was used as a language of courtrooms and law, as I mentioned, so the simple Englishman had virtually little to no access to justice. However, the end of the Norman era was also marked by the disappearance of slavery, which was eradicated by the pure nature of the feudal relationships between masters and serfs. That became the center of the societal life. So this is the beginning of England and the aristocratic rule over the British Isles. Later, the first royal family will be established by the name of Plantagenets. So thank you very much for your attention. Goodbye.